We're outside of El Paso, Texas, USA, way out in the absolute middle of nowhere with dozens of Army personnel doing some training which involves utilizing an air ambulance to evacuate one of their soldiers from the battlefield when disaster strikes. We have a pilot with thousands of hours of flight experience, but almost none with the new technology that he has on this flight. This is a strange one, and stick around until the end when you hear the mind-boggling circumstances surrounding this crash. The full story coming up on this episode of the Dr. Medic. Now, the operator in this incident was technically a company called Enchantment Aviation, who were doing business under the local brand name of Southwest MedEvac. Now, Southwest MedEvac fell under the old umbrella of OmniFlight, which itself was technically under the control of Air Group Holdings, which was eventually acquired by Air Methods back in 2011 for a cool $200 million. Now, at the time, Southwest MedEvac had 10 helicopters and 4 fixed-wing aircraft with over 150 employees. And while many medical helicopters are staffed with a flight nurse and a flight paramedic, this one was staffed with 2 flight paramedics, as Southwest MedEvac had a unique contract with the Army base at Fort Bliss to provide medical coverage for their base and specifically to fly out into the middle of nowhere and pick up injured soldiers during training missions. Now, the aircraft was this Aerospatiale AS350B3 built way back in 2010, which had over 8,500 hours of time on the airframe. Now, powering this A-Star was a single turbo mecha aerial 1D1 turboshaft engine making about 730 horsepower. This helicopter was set up in the standard air ambulance format, stars with the pilot seated in the front right, with several seats facing forward along the rear bulkhead and a patient litter system directly to the pilot's left and in front of the aft seat. Now, the pilot in this accident was 63-year-old William H. Montgomery. Now, Mr. Montgomery has got to not only be one of the most experienced helicopter pilots I've ever seen in EMS, but also one with one of the coolest aviation backgrounds. You see, Mr. Montgomery held commercial pilot certificates for airplane, single-engine land, helicopter, and instrument helicopter, but also held an airline transport pilot certificate for airplane and multi-engine land with type ratings in the Boeing 707, 720, 737, 757, and 767, and even the super advanced, for the time, Lockheed Martin L-1011. And yes, I said 720, which was a weird plane that existed that was basically a shorter version of the 707. Now, he had over 17,600 hours of flight time with 5,100 hours in helicopters and a whopping 3,300 hours flying at night. He did hold a first-class medical, with his only condition being corrective lenses. Now, I'm going to hold off on the rest of the pilot's background until the end of this story, as I think it might make things a bit more clear that way. Now, sitting right behind Mr. Montgomery was flight paramedic Anthony Archuleta, and seated to his left at the head of the patient litter system was flight paramedic John Sutter. Now, the weather on this evening could not have been any nicer. Winds were calm, visibility was over 10 miles, skies were clear, the temp was 46 degrees Fahrenheit with a dew point of 28, but there was no moon illumination with lots of dark and rolling terrain, and this will be an important factor later on. Now, Southwest MedEvac had a unique setup out there in El Paso, as they had a contract with the United States Army at Fort Bliss to provide air ambulance coverage and also to participate in simulations. Now, on the night of February 5th, 2010, just after 1,800 hours, personnel at McGregor Range in southern New Mexico, which is a training range about 40 miles northeast of El Paso, Texas, contacted the Mesa Dispatch Center to request a medevac helicopter for a training exercise. Now, the pilot notified dispatch at 18:33 that they were airborne and en route. Now, when the helicopter was about 500 meters or so away from the main coordinates, there was an Army officer on the ground who notified dispatch that they could see the helicopter, but that for some reason they were unable to communicate directly with the helicopter via their radios. Now, remember, it is nighttime and it is 100% pitch black in the middle of nowhere, with no moon illumination and no artificial light on the ground. Dispatch and the ground Army personnel are now discussing options to switch radio bands and frequencies to communicate with the helicopter when at 1854 the helicopter pilot informs dispatch that they are actually over the landing zone, yet they cannot see or actually locate the landing zone on the ground. They continue to fly around for another 5 or 6 minutes when at 1900, that same Army officer notifies dispatch that his Army personnel are all there at the landing zone and that they cannot see or hear any helicopter, forcing the Army officer to relay new coordinates to dispatch to share with the pilot. Now, even after the new coordinates were given, Army personnel on the ground had to call dispatch again to contact the pilot as they could now see the helicopter, but that it was flying in the opposite direction and needed to turn around. This back and forth goes on for nearly another 25 minutes when the pilot finally informs dispatch that they can now see the landing zone and are about to perform some reconnaissance flights and then land. The pilot did arrive at the landing zone, and Army personnel noted that the helicopter made 2 full right orbits of the landing zone, and that during these orbits, the helicopter was seen turning on and panning their white spotlight. The ground Army personnel were still unsuccessful in reaching the helicopter by radio and even began waving chemical light sticks in an attempt to signal the helicopter. The helicopter then makes a 3rd orbit, but this orbit is much wider than the first 2, and during this final orbit, Army personnel noted that the helicopter made approximately a 45-degree turn and entered a steep nose-down attitude before flying the helicopter directly into the ground. None of the witnesses on the ground reported that they saw any attempt by the helicopter to avoid impacting the ground. 63-year-old William H. Montgomery of Avondale, Arizona, 34-year-old John Sutter from Las Cruces, New Mexico, and 54-year-old Anthony Archuleta from El Paso, Texas, all died in this crash. So what caused this helicopter to fly straight into the ground? Well, there are some important key factors to explore here. The first is going to be night vision goggles, or NVGs. Now, this crash happened back in 2010, and at the time, NVGs were not a requirement for Part 135 helicopter operations. In fact, it wasn't until 4 years later in 2014 that the FAA actually undertook a major study due in part to the recurring controlled flight into terrain accidents at night by helicopter air ambulance pilots just like this one. The results of that study? The FAA did not recommend a proposal to require NVGs for nighttime air ambulance helicopter operations. Nonetheless, many operators around the country were easily able to see the benefits of implementing such a technology. Without going into great detail for this episode, a pilot cannot just slap on a pair of NVGs and take a flight. They have to go through approved training, as the NVGs take some getting used to, and they do have some of their own limitation, such as losing some depth perception and actually being a little too clear sometimes, to the point that it can sometimes fool pilots into thinking that there are not any clouds in the sky when they could actually be flying through some type of mist and fog. But limitations aside, the benefits of these NVGs absolutely outweigh any cons that might be present, as they drastically enhance the ability for the pilot and the med crew to see and fly at night. Now, in addition to the training that all crew members have to go through with NVGs, the aircraft itself has to be modified and given a supplemental type certificate to ensure that things like lights and gauges are NVG compliant and do not interfere with the function of the NVGs. Now, this particular helicopter was modified via a supplemental type certificate for the installation of night vision goggle compatible interior lighting on January 5th, 2009. Now, let's look at the pilot's training and experience, though, with NVGs. Now, Pilot Montgomery had just recently been hired by Southwest MedEvac. At the time of this accident, even with all of that experience that I previously mentioned, the pilot had accumulated 22 hours in an A350B3 and just 1.5 hours in a B2 model, which was the same model as the accident aircraft. Out of the 17,000 plus hours that this pilot has had, he had just 7.5 hours on NVGs. Now, this accident flight was just the pilot's second non-training flight with this company and his first non-training NVG flight. He had also never operated in the McGregor military range prior to the accident. Now, I cannot emphasize just how absolutely in the middle of nowhere this military range is. Now, Pilot Montgomery had just received his most recent NVG check ride a few days before the crash, but the records indicate that all of his NVG training had been conducted on nights with high moon illumination and lots of cultural lighting from highly populated cities. You see, contrary to popular belief, NVGs actually need some form of light to operate. The green light systems that most of us use, in very simple terms, just enhance and amplify the amount of light that already exists to present the wearer of the goggles with a low light image that is easier to see than if they didn't have the goggles at all. Too much light can actually make them a bit useless, but when you're flying over rural land with lights dotted throughout the landscape, this is where NVGs really become useful in seeing obstructions. Things tend to get a little less clear when you are in pitch black conditions though. Now, even if there is no light on the ground, some great moonlight can do wonders to enhance the NVGs, but when there is no moon and no ground lighting from street lights and homes and businesses, then the image in the NVGs is just a little more difficult to interpret and see. Now, pilots are taught to periodically come off of their NVGs or look under their goggles so that they can compare the real vision of the real world with the NVG image. Now, again, I am drastically simplifying how all of this works, but the point is that NVGs do have their limitations, and it takes training and experience to become proficient in their use, especially in completely blacked out conditions. So, Pilot Montgomery only had a few hours of experience in this type of helicopter, even less hours of training on NVGs, and literally 0 hours of training in completely blacked out conditions and no experience flying in this region. Now, I told you that I would come back to the pilot's medical clearance, and if things were not bad enough with the NVG training or lack thereof, wait till you hear this. I told you that Pilot Montgomery did have a first-class medical certificate which required him to wear corrective lenses while flying. But he also had a special medical certificate for a history of vitreous exchange, which is where they basically replace the gelatinous fluid in your eyeball, which is normally impossible to replace. He also had a retinal detachment, which is where the retina in the back of your eye is separated from the blood vessels that provide it with nutrients and oxygen. He had cataract surgery, where they cut out the lens of your eye and replace it with an artificial one. And he had glaucoma, which is a generic term for all kinds of diseases that can cause vision loss and blindness by damaging the optic nerves in the back of your eyeballs. So you have a super experienced pilot who is a brand new hire. He has very little time in the aircraft type and almost no time on NVGs. The time that he does have on NVGs did not duplicate the conditions that he would be flying in on the accident night. He has no experience flying in this particular military range, and there is a communications problem between the ground army personnel and the pilot where the pilot cannot even find the landing zone. The pilot ends up using a spotlight that cannot be used with his NVGs, and to make it all worse, the pilot has pretty much every terrible eye pathology known to man, yet somehow still gets a medical clearance. And the icing on the cake, the information that I just gave you about his eye diseases, those were all in his FAA records. But after the accident, investigators actually visited with Pilot Montgomery's ophthalmologist and optometrist only to find 2 unreported instances of cystoid macular edema, which causes swelling and edema of the retina, which caused distortion in the right eye of Pilot Montgomery. All this, and the probable cause is only listed as the pilot's loss of situational awareness resulting in controlled flight into terrain. And contributing to the accident was the pilot's unfamiliarity with the hazards of a low contrast area while using night vision goggles. No mention of the eye issues in the probable cause. Now, remember that at the time of this accident, Omniflight was the main operator at play here with 100 aircraft in 18 states. Omniflight had a terrible run of 5 air ambulance crashes in just 6 months. They had a helicopter crash into some poles at a hospital in South Carolina. Another pilot literally ran out of gas during a flight in Arizona. Just 3 days after that, another crash occurred in South Carolina that killed the entire crew. 2 months later, another crash happened during a training exercise in Arizona, and then a few months after that is when this deadly crash occurred in El Paso, Texas. Now, folks, there's always something to learn from accidents like this, and please never forget that learning is the entire purpose of this channel. Far too often, these mistakes are hidden or hushed for all the wrong reasons. Mistakes like this, while tragic, absolutely must be talked about so we can learn from them and get better as we move forward. So, what have we learned? Hopefully we learned that NVGs make a huge difference in the overall safety of nighttime helicopter operations, but there are limitations, and those limitations require the appropriate training and experience in order for both pilots and the med crew to operate with them safely. Hopefully we learned that 2 strikes should be good enough. It took this pilot 3 tries to find his landing zone. Now, as a crew member, when the second one doesn't go as planned, that is probably a good time to make the call, invoke your 51% rule, cancel the flight, and return to base. Better to debrief about what went wrong than for everybody to die. I think we also learned that we should all be glad that Omniflight is no longer in business. And last but not least, when a pilot has this many issues with their eyes, they should probably have a bit more scrutiny when being issued waivers, especially medical clearances. Now, I am certainly curious what you all think. Do you think that a pilot with this many medical issues with his vision should be flying single pilot operations at night? As a paramedic or a flight nurse, would you feel comfortable flying with a pilot knowing that these medical issues were present? Let me know in the comments below, as I truly am interested to know how the HEMS community, both from the aviation standpoint and the med crew side, feels about situations like this. Anyway, thank you guys for taking the time to watch and listen. I do hope that every one of you stays safe out there, and I hope to see you all on the next episode.